Welcome back to One Comic Book Day, where we're celebrating the first 10 years of Superman. Should have bought some confetti or some streamers or something that makes noise. That would have been smart. I'm not very smart. I think this video will show that. This has been a difficult video to sort of plan, as I'm not happy with anything I come up with. Early on, I tried to do evolution videos, usually like every 10 issues of Action Comics. By the way, we're going to be talking more about Action Comics than Superman because it's a lot easier for me to know where something is happening when it comes to Action Comics than Superman, because Superman had 4 stories. Superman was coming out quarterly, and now it comes out like bi-monthly or every other month. So a lot of the times I don't even know where Superman is happening in relations to Action Comics, which is coming out every month and has 1 story. It's just easier for my mind to wrap around what is happening and what era of Superman in those first 10 years we're sort of talking about when I talk about Action Comics over Superman. But this is a video where I feel like I should be able to point at things and say, like, this issue is the first time Superman does this. This is a prime example of what I'm talking about. And that's not easy to do because, well, the key thing and why I stopped doing those videos, 10 things we knew about Superman at that time, is because everything is so gradual that you either don't notice it right away or there's some debate if something is actually happening. For example, like, when is the first time Superman flies? He's flying in the radio show because it's just simpler to talk about. I feel like I'm saying easy and simpler a lot in this, but it's true. It's simpler to describe. While in the comics, most people would say like issue 10 of Superman. It's unfortunate I just gave that speech about Action Comics and now we're talking about Superman. Because of a technicality, he seems to be hovering instead of falling. I would say in the 30s in Action Comics, not exactly falling, but seeming to be static in the air happened a lot. And that could just be like artists not doing a great job at explaining that he's falling or flying. And this happens for several issues until like one time he goes straight up. Even then there's some like debate over when he's actually flying that I don't actually have a good answer for because it's so gradual. And that is true for a lot of Superman. But sort of starting at the beginning, is the Superman from Action Comics number 10 to Action Comics 122, where I believe we left off, a different character? Absolutely. There is no argument to that. Especially for those first 10 issues of Action Comics. He is a very different character. Is he the Superman we know and love now? No. He's still cooking. He's still baking. He's definitely closer. And I think he'll be more like this for foreseeable future. I think the Silver Age, and especially the Bronze Age, he's going to have a big turn. 50 Superman will be different in ways, but essentially the same character. We'll get into the 50s. I will be doing a video about the 50s and why I think it's the dark ages of comics once we hit the issues of January 1st, 1950. And believe me, I've been working on that video and putting more work into that than any of the other videos. I've been reciting that one in my head like 3 or 4 times every day. I know that essay. But here, that gradual problem. Now, what's funny is when I was doing those videos of like the 10 things we've learned about Superman, I was sort of like separating it by like every 10 issue of Action Comics, and that seemed to not be working. Now thinking about it later on, a lot of the time talking about it in 10 issues of Action Comics does work. Like the first 10 issues of Superman, if I was going to give like an era or a title to the Superman, it's maybe Rough Draft. There isn't like a really good title to give to the Superman. Maybe Reactive Superman, because that's how I would describe the Superman of the first 10 Action Comics, is he's very reactive. And when he's being, active instead of reactive, he's doing horrifying things, like in Action Comics number 4 and Action Comics number 8, the comics where he kidnaps a guy, holds him captive so he can cheat at a football game to stop another football team from cheating, or 8, where he destroys the slums. Gives no one any warning of that, just destroys the slums. So maybe we want him to be reactive. And that doesn't sound great for a character because he doesn't have much of a character, or at least he doesn't have much of a personality. You don't get a lot from him or him speaking at times. He's just kind of doing things. Like, this is very true in Action Comics #1, where we just meet him holding a woman jumping through the night sky. He kind of has some things to say. It's just he's sort of forceful and just like, no, we need to do this. And to be fair, the Max Fleischer cartoon Superman is very much like that, though there is some little twinkle and eye winking at the end that gives him his personality. But like the Max Fleischer cartoons have the opening of something happening, and then this looks like a job for Superman. But structurally, that works a lot better than what they were doing in Action Comics, where a lot of the time, I would say you would start at this looks like a job for Superman before setting up the threat. And just visually and structurally, this works so much better. And why I like those Max Fleischer cartoons more than I like the first 10 to actually a lot of these issues of Superman, to be honest. But like cartoons and shorts, movies, however you want to define the Max Fleischer cartoons, have a structure while comics don't. And especially in those first 10 of Action Comics, they don't really understand how to write a comic because comics is still a new form. They're used to them as the daily comic book strip of like 5 panels. Now we're dealing with however many panels they're doing in like 14 pages. And it takes a while for them to figure it out. Like, one of the big critiques I have that doesn't really stop till, I don't know, the 20s? I mean Action Comics 20s. I don't like just saying the 20s because it sounds like I'm talking about a comic book from the 1920s, which I won't be because he started in 38. But Siegel had this problem where they weren't depicting things. He would explain things in the narration and you would see Superman vaguely do something, like jump into the water is when I remember, while explaining like 5 different things Superman was doing at the time. That was not good storytelling. And it took a while for artists to sort of quite get how to effectively tell a story in the amount of pages they were given. It's like night and day comparing Action Comics 122 to Action Comics #1. Action Comics #1 also has the unfortunate problem of being like 5 or 6 different stories when it is listed as Superman, Champion of the Oppressed, or just Superman, depending on who you talk to or who you look at. This Superman especially isn't very precious about life. He's not exactly killing people, but for a while, and this last, I don't even know how long to say that lasts. It's so gradual. To like the 40s or 50s of this first 10 years? It's hard to say. And I think if we were doing this way more simplistic, we could divide Superman into pre-war Superman and post-war Superman, or you could go further and say pre, during war, and post-war. Though I don't really think post and during are all that different. Structurally in the stories they're telling, and actually we could divide this by the stories and that would probably be easier, but it's not really talking much about Superman. Because it's really the storytelling that changes more drastically than he does. So this Superman's not precious about life. He's not exactly murdering people, but he's letting people die or is directly responsible for something that kills them. He's also very big in threatening people. This more or less goes away because he's fighting bigger villains who are doing obvious crimes that he doesn't really have to prove. But when he had to prove crimes, he's just going to force the guy into admitting something, which is not very Superman. This is a guy who wants to help people or make them better or believes in us. Yeah, Action Comics tend to, actually a lot of still, the first 10 years of Superman does not believe in that. But he especially doesn't believe in it in the early. My God, does he not. And when we get to the 10s, the teens, this is more of an era, I think, of Superman fighting the Ultra Humanite. Like, a lot of the stories end up being him versus the Ultra Humanite. It's a story, in fact. Like, you get the first Ultra Humanite story around Action Comics 11, and then he goes away by 20. This is when some things are solidified. This is when George Taylor becomes Perry White. This is when Metropolis, unnamed, or is Cleveland, depending on who you talk to, becomes Metropolis. It's when the Daily Star becomes the Daily Planet. So in a lot of cases, rough drafts of ideas for Superman are gone and we get sort of what they are today. But mainly it's all Ultra Humanite. Ultra Humanite, of course, was sort of a prototype Lex Luthor. He's in a wheelchair, he's super smart, he gets away with death several times, and becomes a woman for a while too before his final story. And in fact, we're left with the question if he was going to return, but he goes away fairly quickly because by issue 21, we have Lex Luthor, and we're definitely in the war at this point. So yeah, there's not a lot to say about that 10 issues of Action Comics other than he's fighting the Ultra Humanite and we get our first supervillain. But in the 20s, you start seeing what becomes more of an experimental Superman, and that's not even a correct term for him. I don't even know how to describe the Superman of the next, 30 to 40 Action Comics. They're definitely trying a lot more things. So this is where you get a lot more superpowers showing up. Or you get like issues, and this is because of different writers. So you get like a Superman who is very talkative, who is making jokes, making light of things. He has some wisecracks, and then the very next story, and sometimes just in Superman, in the 4 stories of Superman, where he's much more fun than he was before. But you have him getting superpowers. This is the era of him being able to change his face, or things that lasted for a while. He had hypnosis. He had his version of the Vulcan neck pinch. Gotta overpronounce neck because someone complained I was saying Nick before, but whatever. The neck pinch, which he used on Lois way too often. And then that went away. His sensitive hearing, telescopic vision, and his X-ray vision sort of appear around this time. Once again, very hard to pinpoint when that starts. But it starts, and it definitely feels like they're exploring Superman a lot more, or trying to figure out who exactly this character is. This is also when we start getting our other supervillains, though these are, except for Luthor, who had hair to begin with, the villains that aren't exactly all that long-lasting. This is the Wolfing Hands. These are the Pranksters. These are the Puzzlers. Villains who are not around today. They do last till Crisis and then kind of go away because they weren't very strong villains. And in a lot of cases, as I said, it's easier to separate these by stories or what kind of stories they were telling. A lot of these villains had a default or stereotypical story they would tell for like the first 3 or 4 stories of that character before they would move on. As for, say, the other characters, Perry is still not very well defined. I do not know who this guy is other than yelling about doing stories. Lois is the only other character you can really talk about, as Jimmy is gone. Jimmy shows up during this time, a main character every 20 Action Comics or so. They've definitely forgotten about him currently. There was also a character that maybe you don't remember, called Sergeant Casey, who was sort of this police foil to Clark and Superman. He didn't really like Superman, who just went away after a while. I had to look up his name because I entirely forgot. I knew there was an officer he dealt with. What was that guy's name? It was Sergeant Casey. It was 100% Sergeant Casey. And Sergeant Casey just went away. He does kind of come back. He is written out by Crisis, though I've heard that Dark Crisis did somehow bring him back. Though Death Metal should have technically brought him back, that might be a mistake, because Death Metal restored all continuity. But it's Lois who really changes, because Lois is a very career-driven, she's cold, she despises Clark for those first couple of stories, and even gets him fired in Action Comics 9? Action Comics 10? I think it's 9, where she gets him fired and is also sort of what they use for the climax of the Richard Donner Superman. It involves a flood. Dam breaks, floods, which is the climax of Superman, just without the nukes. But she's such a fascinating character, and unfortunately, she's starting to evolve. You know, she loses the coldness and is a lot nicer, but she is very competitive towards Clark and very career-driven still. But we're starting to get, and it makes sense as we're going to the 50s, the Lois who seems to be more obsessed about getting married or being in love with Superman. She's definitely into Superman, but I don't feel like that's like the driving point of a lot of her actions. And that's what's going to happen in the 1950s, unfortunately. And something to bring up just really quickly here is that doesn't have a lot of bearing to this, but it's how the comic has changed. I'm going to talk more about this in the 50s video, but comics aren't doing well by the end of the 1940s. In fact, it starts in the mid-40s, but sales are not great. There was essentially a crash, and that's what you really need to know. And for the most part, I hadn't really noticed any huge change until a few times going through the 50s video, something finally went ding in my brain. Sometimes I'm too slow. But in the late 40s, we're now seeing Action Comics and Superman cut content. And by that I mean they used to be like 64, 65, 66 pages. They're now around 52, and there are less stories. Superman went from 4 stories to 3 stories and a Lois Lane story to now just 3 stories. They've cut around 12 pages an issue. And the reason I eventually noticed this is there's now ads happening in the middle of Superman stories in the Superman comic. So they're either have the same amount of ads they did with 12 more pages, or they actually have more ads. Either way, they're trying to make more money on less content, and it took me way too long to figure that out. Action Comics has also lost around 12 pages, but in a weird way, they went from, I believe, 7 different characters they focused on, which they were doing in Action Comics #1 and for a long time, to about 5 now. So Action Comics is losing characters that no one cares about, or at least weren't huge like Superman. Because remember, Superman's been on the cover of Action Comics consistently since, I believe, Action Comics 14. He was on a lot of the covers before that, but it became officially just Superman on the cover by Action Comics 14. In a lot of ways, this Superman is kind of the same Superman or a wildly different Superman depending on the writer, until like Action Comics 60. Now, the 60s of Action Comics, I really define by the story. This is this weird era that I didn't realize stopped after a while, but I was complaining in those videos that a lot of them have bookends. So it's someone telling a story about Superman. In several cases, they're making up a story about Superman, which I just find hilarious, because you don't have to make up a story about Superman in the universe of Superman. You're making up a story about Superman now. You can eventually do that, but they were doing a lot of them right next to each other. But this is a Superman where I'm really loving some stories because they have somewhat of a structure figured out. This is in the 60s, you get Cinderella a la Superman, which is still like my high point for Superman. But, a teaser for the future. I have definitely read a Golden Age Superman story that might rival, or I even might love more than that issue. And more surprisingly, almost a slap in my face, it's a racketeering story. Kind of. The villains are racketeers. How dare they prove me wrong? How dare they? But that will be in that video. It's fascinating how often they were doing this and then it just went away. Like, it would make sense if it was happening every so often, but it was happening almost every story in the 60s. They just got an idea and they really ran with it. But as you start getting to the 70s and 80s, you do get the villains, the really good villains. You get your Mr. Mxyzptlk and you get your Toyman, who are all better villains because they do bigger things, but the more important thing they do is they always focus on causing problems from Superman, that he has to save people, or he's distracted, or they take Lois and it's difficult, which the prankster, Wolfingham, and the puzzler can't really do to the extent that, you know, a magical imp can do. But this Superman does have personality. He's definitely having longer conversations. We're getting to know him better. He talks to Lois a lot. This is the endings of them fighting over who gets what scoop, or someone surprises the other person with the scoop. This is the generic way that the comics are still ending with. But you're starting to see these supervillains show up, and then the stories become way more involved with his rogues gallery, which is definitely more interesting for him to deal with, and he has more to say, and there's more of a rapport. But he's still not exactly the most amazing character. Like, we don't really learn much about Clark, per se. There isn't a lot of time spent to Clark. You get Superman showing up and dealing with things, and in that way, he's still reactive. It's just, he's not only reactive in these stories. But he's gentler, more calm. He's not wildly coming up with superpowers on the fly, though it still happens. It's just not happening all at once. But thinking over this the past few days, it's so gradual that it's hard to talk about when we get into like the post-war Superman, because I know how he's different from the beginning. It's just so hard to get across who this Superman is and how to explain that without gradually reading every one of these issues. The character is more calm. He's not being overtly destructive to everything around him. He listens. and he does seem to care about people, which is something they kind of forgot about early on. He just seems early Superman, that very early Superman, is being a hero just because he's written to be a hero. This Superman, the Superman we've gotten to does seem to care about people or doing the right thing or explaining why the right thing is important. Not to the great extent he is now, but God, in another way, we have more of a rough draft to the modern Superman by the time we're at the end of the 40s. And like what I said, it's hard to come up with names for things when nothing quite works. You don't have a good section off of each era of Superman. And I'm sure by the time we get to the 50s, there will be a gradual difference by who this character is that I still can't quite put my finger on. You know, I thought it would be easier, but it's not. I feel like this is falling apart at the end, unfortunately, as my small vocabulary is failing me trying to explain who this Superman is from Over Action Comics 100. He is the same, but not the same. It's almost like his aura is different. What I'm trying to say is the Superman early on was way more aggressive and seemed less approachable. He seems approachable now. And I think once you get to like the 50s and the 60s of Action Comics and the end of World War II or during World War II, he is way more consistent. They're not experimenting as much with Superman. They're experimenting with the stories at times, but they seem to be happy with the version of Superman they have. And is this Superman different from the early Superman? I've already said yes, but in the same ways, the gradual progression of him makes it hard to really say for certain, to really give you an idea of what that is without reading it. The vibes are different. Yeah, the vibes are different. And even as we go, you can argue that Superman has always been consistent. He is this unstoppable God-man who will save you. It's just how much more approachable, how much kinder and gentler his overall vibe is what changes. And you really need to read that to really understand what I'm saying. God, I wish it was way more easier to explain. But hey, maybe it was simpler to say pre and post war. But we'll see how that changes. Maybe it will be much more identifiable. And that's really what we've learned is Superman is always the same and always different. That feels like a cop-out. Anyway, we're going to be covering other things coming up as we get into the 1950s. Like I said, we're doing a whole 50s video explaining what's happening in the 50s and why I think it's the Dark Ages. I'm also going to do a video on Mort Weisinger. I don't know what that video is going to be other than just saying Mort Weisinger was a jerk and abusive, but he had an idea of what Superman was that I'm much happier with. Really wish he wasn't such a jerk. It's going to be stories about how he's a jerk for a while. One of them might not be true. And maybe a video on Otto Bender, but I'm gonna have to do way more research on Otto Bender. I just know Otto Bender's stories and how they were some of the best Superman stories, especially of the 1950s. But yeah, that's where we're going, and please join me for the next 10 years as we celebrate the 20th anniversary of Superman in 1958. I know, as I said, it was much easier to talk about the first 50 to 60 issues of Action Comics versus the last 60 issues of Action Comics. But this is where we are. So please, have a great day.